Beautiful, right? Um, Welcome everybody. Everybody is welcome, and please always share. It's great. Welcome. So that was a piece that Puccini wrote sometime around 1910. You know, there's a lot of his music that doesn't have dates on it. He puttered around a lot. And I'll talk about this later, but it turns out he was a very unsure person. He was always second guessing himself and mulling it over. Um, at one point, towards the end of his life, when he was starting to write this opera, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but it occurs to me now, and I'll tell you. When he was getting ready to write this opera, he had been thinking for years about writing an opera about Marie Antoinette, about her life, about what happened, about her execution. And he thought about it for 10 years and he worked on it for 3 years. And he sort of drove his librettist crazy because he'd go back and forth and he'd think, well, maybe I should, maybe I shouldn't. And finally he gave it up. So he was a guy who was contrary to what I would have imagined, because his music is so bold and sexy and, you know, he was a guy who was maybe a little tortured inside. Anyway, thank you all for coming tonight. I hope everybody's well, and I hope we are all feeling a little better this week. My hope is onwards and upwards. So tonight, Puccini. His full name is Giacomo Antonio Domenico Michele Secondo Maria Puccini. And I have a picture of him. He's born 22nd of December 1858 to the 29th of November 1924. So 1858, from the middle of the 19th century to really the first quarter of the 20th century. To me, there's something amazing about a composer who straddles those two centuries. I guess I myself also straddle two centuries, and I don't think it's that amazing, but there's something about that. He's from a town called Lucca, which if you've never been, you have to go. The hill towns in that part of northern Italy are stupendous. Volterra, Siena, San Gimignano. They're east of Pisa, west of Florence. I have a map. So you can see where Florence is. You can see where Lucca is near the further west. But south is Siena and Volterra, and in Volterra, we will travel. There is an amazing amphitheater, and also there's a museum in Volterra that has all these Etruscan tombs. They're all very cool. So he's from Lucca, and he settles in. You see where the arrow is. He settles in Viareggio, and but first he settles in a little south of Viareggio, and I can't think of the name right now, but he basically stays near home. He likes being home. He likes the country. He was the sixth of 9 children. He comes from a long musical dynasty. His great-great-grandfather, also Giacomo, was the Maestro di Cappella, the Kapellmeister, in the Cathedral of San Martino in Lucca. And his family, his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, and his great-great-grandfather were the guys who composed and performed music in the church. Puccini's father, Michele, died when Puccini was still a boy. He wasn't even 5 years old yet. So the line was broken. He wasn't old enough to take over the music at the cathedral, although he did sing in the boys' choir, and he worked later as a substitute organist. He got a general education at the seminary of San Michele in Lucca, where everyone expected him to show musical talent. Instead, he was lazy and shiftless, poor at schoolwork, and apt to play hooky. There's a story of him stealing organ pipes to buy candy. But his mother believed in him and got him a tutor, and then he started making progress. When he was 17, he attended a performance of Verdi's Aida, and a light went off or on. He was convinced that a career as an opera composer was the only thing he wanted. So one of his uncles supervised his music education, and he got a scholarship from the Queen Margherita, who was the royal consort of King Umberto I. And he got financial assistance from another uncle. And so he was able to go to the conservatory in Milan, where he studied composition. Among others, one of his teachers was Amilcare Ponchielli, who is known for the Dance of the Hours from the opera La Gioconda. I really like this version.
Hello, mother. Hello, father. Here I am at...
All right, so we don't need to listen to all of that. That was Alan Sherman, who I think was wonderful. A depressed guy, by the way, who made very funny things. Puccini's roommate for 3 years at the conservatory was a guy named Pietro Mascagni. Anybody know that name? He wrote Cavalleria Rusticana. And he wrote Cavalleria Rusticana was basically the only thing he did that was famous. And who knows, if Puccini hadn't come along, Mascagni may not have been eclipsed. But in 1880, at the age of 22, Puccini composes a mass, which sort of is the bookend of his family's long association with church music. And this mass attracted attention, and it was the first mark he made on the map of Italian composers. Undoubtedly, while he was at the conservatory, he really struggled for money. He really didn't have any money. And later on in life, it was sort of unpleasant because he was very stingy later in life, even though he himself had been poor himself. But there's also a story told by a guy named Arturo Buzzi-Pieccia, who was a friend of Puccini's from those days, claiming that he and Puccini used to cheat at cards by humming a melody that was, in fact, a code that corresponded to the values of the cards they held, which I think is pretty clever. Through his life, this is an aside, Puccini has a reputation of being kind of nasty and stingy and lazy and shiftless. Truth was, and I said this earlier and I'll say it again later, he was riddled with self-doubt. He was prone to indecision and self-pity. He had none of the self-confidence and braggadocio that Verdi had. Verdi was very secure and very sure of himself. And maybe this was also one of the reasons for Puccini's constant philandering. He was just a manifestation of his anxiety and insecurity. And of course, I'm going to talk about the philandering later. Reminds me that you don't really ever know what another person is thinking. It's easy to judge without knowing for sure what they do. Everybody has some kind of story that we don't know. And here's a famous guy who I've known his music forever, and I didn't know this about him. Anyway, in 1883, he writes an orchestral piece, Capriccio Sinfonico, which was his thesis for his composition at the conservatory. And it was performed in a student concert and was favorably reviewed in the Milan press. So his reputation really started there. After that concert, his teacher, Ponchielli, encouraged him to enter an opera competition. And he connects him with a librettist, a guy named Ferdinando Fontana, who wrote the libretto for Puccini's opera Le Villi. It was entered into the competition, which he didn't win, but he got the attention of the publishing house Ricordi, who liked what they heard. They printed the libretto for him without charge, and later bought the work, published it, and more importantly, Giulio Ricordi commissioned Puccini to write another opera. This next opera was Edgar. Again, he was paired with the librettist Fontana, and the opera was a huge flop. Ricordi felt that the work was weak because the libretto was not good. And he still saw promise in Puccini, and so he continued supporting him. Despite the fact that during this time, Puccini ran away with one of his piano students, a 24-year-old married woman with two children named Elvira Gemignani. I'm going to take a brief aside because this is juicy stuff. In 1884, Puccini begins an affair with Elvira, who was very unhappily married. Eventually, in 1903, her husband was killed by the jealous husband of a woman with whom he was having an affair. Way before her husband died, though, she took their daughter and her son Antonio, who was born in 1886, whose father was Puccini, and just moved in with Puccini. I didn't think those things happened in those days, but I guess they did. Puccini and Elvira don't get married until 1904, 20 years later. Naturally, based on the genesis of their relationship, Elvira was a very suspicious and jealous woman. Puccini, moreover, was a handsome man with a roving eye, and once he became famous, he had endless, poorly concealed affairs. Wikipedia lists at least 6 women with whom Puccini had passionate, or maybe the word is torrid, affairs, writing for years, letters, love letters. Here are some pictures of these women. So, most of them were sopranos who were singing operas that he, and I have their names. If I can write it. I'll write them down in the movie, in the video. Yeah, most of them were sopranos, and he just and the thing is, I think he honestly fell madly in love with these women. He really just was passionate. So in 1909, and I spoke about this in the last Salon, but not everybody was there. In 1909, Elvira accuses him of sleeping with the chambermaid. She makes her accusations public, and she persecutes the girl for 3 years, eventually firing her. The girl goes home and commits suicide. The autopsy showed that she was a virgin, and Elvira is accused and found guilty of slander and sentenced to 5 months in prison. But Puccini pays the girl's family off and spares his wife from going to jail. In 2007, some letters come out that show that Puccini was actually sleeping with the girl's cousin, and that girl had a baby whose granddaughter is still alive. Personal chaos seems to have interfered with Puccini's composition. The suicide of the girl may also have been a factor in the suicide of the servant girl Liu in the opera Turandot. Just interesting. Anyway, back to his composition trajectory. By all accounts, the libretto by Fontana for Elgar, too, was weak and disorganized. It remains a flop to today. Without the continued personal support from Giulio Ricordi, who, in hindsight, really is a measure of his good judgment that he continued to back Puccini, Puccini's career might have ended right there. But don't forget, Ricordi stood to gain from Puccini's success in the form of royalties from his performances, and his investment was richly rewarded. The Ricordi house got a share of every performance of Puccini operas. So Ricordi decides to stick with him through one more opera. This opera turns out to be Manon Lescaut, which had rocky beginnings because Puccini had learned his lesson from working with Fontana. And the first 4 librettists that he had for working on Manon Lescaut, he didn't like. So he went through a bunch of librettists, one of whom was Ruggero Leoncavallo, the composer of Pagliacci, before settling on 2 guys, Luigi Illica and Giuseppe Giacomo, who he stuck with for the next 3 operas. So these 2 guys, they work, 3 guys, Puccini, Illica, and Giacomo, they work as a team for Manon Lescaut, for Bohème, Tosca, and Butterfly. Manon Lescaut premieres in Turin in 1893, and by a weird coincidence, it was the same week that Verdi's last opera, Falstaff, premieres in La Scala in Milan. So the press was full of, this late opera from an old master and this new opera from a new upstart. And Manon Lescaut was a huge success, and it really was the thing that secured Puccini's reputation as the new guard. In London, George Bernard Shaw wrote after Manon Lescaut opened, Puccini looks to me more like the heir of Verdi than any of his rivals. Bohème also premiered in Turin, which was conducted by Arturo Toscanini. And Toscanini and Puccini were friendly. I have a picture of the two of them. So here they are. It was the fashion to have a mustache in those days. Bohème is based on a story by Henri Mouget, and Ruggero Leoncavallo claims to have been working on a work based on this same story at the same time. But the story was in the public domain. But Leoncavallo tried to have Puccini prevented from doing a treatment of it. Puccini responded, he said, I already started. I had no idea you were working on it. He said, let's just both work on it and see whose work the public prefers. Puccini was lucky in that his work came out, or lucky, his opera was better. It came out a year before, and it's been a favorite of audiences from the beginning. After that came Tosca, which was Puccini's first foray into verismo. And verismo is operas that are not like fairy tales. They show real life. They don't always show fancy people, but more than anything, they can include violence. Also in Tosca, Puccini starts to use a Wagnerian device, the leitmotif. He assigns signatures, musical signatures for specific characters. In 1891, Puccini moves to Torre di Lago. This is the name I was trying to think of, which is south of Viareggio, like by half a mile. Puccini loves hunting and he loves automobiles. And in this part of Italy, there was open space and he could drive, he could hunt. He acquired land in 1900 and had a villa built on the lake where he lived until 1921 when pollution from a nearby peat factory caused him to move to Viareggio. And here's a picture of Puccini with Elvira and their then, you have to check this out because their then 14-year-old son. So that's his son in 1900, and he was born in 1886. So he's already trying the little mustache. So that's the sort of happy family. And remember, in 1900, when this picture was taken, they're still not married. In 1903, Puccini is seriously injured in a car accident. His chauffeur was driving him and Elvira and Antonio home at night, and he drove off the road. The car flipped over. Elvira and the son were ejected from the car and basically unhurt. The chauffeur broke his femur, but was also thrown from the car. But Puccini broke his leg and part of the car was trapped on his chest. He was trapped under the car. And luckily, the accident made a lot of noise, and there was a doctor who lived nearby who came running with other people. They got the car off of him, but his injuries were very severe. And at the same time, they discovered that he had diabetes. And so all of this his recovery was slow. And at that time, he was working on Madame Butterfly, and it just took forever for him to finish it. As a very weird aside, the very next day after he had this accident was the day that Elvira's husband was murdered. Just seems weird. The accident slowed his work on Butterfly, but it paved the way for Elvira to marry Puccini, which they did. At the premiere of Butterfly, the soprano Rosina Storchino was pregnant and publicly having an affair with Toscanini, who was conducting the premiere. And at one point during the performance, her kimono blew open a little bit, and it was very clear how pregnant she was. And the audience started chanting, "Ecco piccolo Toscanini." Here, look, there's little Toscanini. The audience was also very hostile because Puccini had decided to write Butterfly in 2 acts. He wanted the end of the first act to include that moment when Butterfly is waiting for what's his face to come back. And the audience was just not happy with long acts. Puccini would revise Butterfly 5 times before it became the opera we know today. Just like how insecure. And not just insecure, it's like he had a good idea, but he couldn't get it out in the way that was perfect. He goes on to compose Fanciulla del West, which was commissioned by and premiered at the Metropolitan Opera, and La Rondine, which had its premiere during World War II in Monte Carlo, as Monaco was neutral. Here's a picture of an older Puccini. Very dapper guy, I think. You know? He was, yeah. Puccini was pretty much apolitical. He did make an offhand comment to Toscanini that caused a rift between them for a few years, that he said something like, you know, during World War I that, or at the beginning of World War I in 1914, he said something like Italy could benefit from some German organization, and Toscanini didn't find that funny. He also seems to have had some peripheral contact with the very early Mussolini years, but he wasn't really involved with anything political. He just really liked being at home and not getting involved. There was evidence, though, that he did help people. He did offer assistance to people who were adversely affected by the war. In 1923, Puccini is diagnosed with throat cancer. He was a heavy smoker. He goes to Brussels for an experimental treatment. The treatment was very taxing on his system. They do surgery, and he has a heart attack after the surgery, and he dies. And there was a performance of Bohème going on at that moment in Rome, which was stopped, and the orchestra played Chopin's Funeral March for the stunned audience. He was buried in Milan at first, in Toscanini's family tomb, and in 1926, his son arranges for his remains to be transferred to a family tomb that he had specially created inside the Puccini's villa at Torre di Lago. I'm going to show you one last picture of him. This was the year he died. He was only 65 when he died, which is really such a shame. Il Trittico, tonight's spotlight work, was premiered in New York at the Metropolitan Opera on December 14th, 1918, just about 1 month after the end of World War I. Puccini had this idea of doing a triptych for years. He'd been searching for subjects and had really for a long time thought about an opera based on Dante's Divine Comedy. Puccini had also seen a one-act play in Paris in 1912 called Le Houppelande, the Cloak, at the Grand Guignol, I don't know how to say that, Guignol Theater, which was noted, and in those days they intentionally were presenting evenings of 3 one-act productions in completely differing styles. And the story of the Houppelande, the Cape, stayed with him. In 1917, he was shown a sketch for a one-act play set in a convent. Puccini's sister was a nun, and apparently he visited her often. Plus, he was descended from this whole line of church workers, so the rigor of the simple life in the church and the vocabulary was very much in his ear, and he was at ease, and he loved this concept. And the same librettist who pitched him the idea of Suor Angelica pitched him an idea of an opera based on part of Dante's Inferno, which ends up being Gianni Schicchi, and Puccini jumped at it. He loved the idea. He had the germ of this idea was from 1904. He says, at times, and this is from a letter, at times I think about something like La Bohème, with the tragic and the sentimental mixed with the comic, because there's some very funny moments in La Bohème. Ricordi, the famous publishing house in Milan, who made everything happen, was not on board with the triple bill. Ricordi knew that theatrically the logistics of 3 separate stories, sets, costumes, singers, would be a hard sell to theaters. They just wouldn't. It's a big ask. And Puccini, there's correspondence which was unsent. Puccini voiced his distress that his wishes for these operas always to be performed together would be respected. And in fact, after he died, they were often not performed together. Nevertheless, the operas were not smash hits. My feeling is that this music, as opposed to his music in other operas, was rather than showcasing show-stopping arias. This was an attempt by Puccini to have the music set the mood, the emotion, the psychiatry of the pieces. Puccini already knew that he had a talent for bringing audiences to tears with heart-rending arias and love duets. He knew how to create the situation, boy meets girl, the meet cute, whatever, and put the music to it so that everybody would cry. And before this, he really had been a master of melody. And now, I think, he wanted to be a master of mood. In fact, in all three of these operas, there are some very beautiful melodies, but often they're given to the orchestra. So the orchestra's playing this beautiful melody, and on top of it, the singer is singing something very bland, sort of conveying information rather than singing their hearts out. There's a lot of debate about what holds these three operas together. Like, what is the unifying theme? Is there a unifying theme? So you could say it's family. There's a child in each opera. You could say it's death. There's death in each opera. The idea of Dante's Divine Comedy being the Genesis also works. Dante's work is divided into three parts. Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso, hell, purgatory, and heaven. And you can say that these apply to these operas. Then there's the notion that in each opera there is some form of entrapment, that's the unifying thing. Musicologist Fedele D'Amico suggests that Puccini's purpose was simple. He just wanted to show that he could write three different operas having nothing in common but this, to be completely different from each other. My favorite theory, though, is this. The 1918 critic, James Huneker, compared the music, which he found clever and characteristic, to a lyric symphony, in which Il Tabarro is the first allegro, Suor Angelica is the adagio, and Johnny Schicchi is the madcap presto at the end, sort of the way a symphony is done, a fast, slow, fast. In any case, the story of Gianni Schicchi comes directly from Dante's Inferno. There is a family, he describes a family named Donati, who apparently Dante's wife was related to them, so he knew this story. So we'll start with Tabarro, which is translated as the cloak. Here's a list of the characters and their voice types. So we have Michele, who is the barge owner. We have Giorgetta, his wife. We have Luigi, who is a stevedore and also Giorgetta's lover. And then there are ancillary characters who add musical interest but aren't really. And maybe there are lovers who might be a foil for the fact that Michele and Giorgetta are so unhappy. The basic story of the opera is Giorgetta and Michele live on a barge on the Seine. The river life goes on around them. Stevedores, shop girls, drinking, working people. They are a very unhappy couple. Their son died a year earlier, and the tender nights when Michele would shelter his little family under his cloak against the raw, cold nights are long over. Michele correctly suspects that Giorgetta is unfaithful, and in the course of this one night, their marriage comes to a brutal end. I'm not going to give you the details because that's a spoiler alert for those of you who don't know the opera. At this point, as we talk about the music, we're going to take a little detour into some very basic music history and theory. Last week, I made a little video. It's about 7 minutes long. We're going to take a little second and talk about music. The history of music it comes from the church. There was singing in the church And there were strict rules at the beginning about what could be played and what couldn't, because they felt like some music was just too exciting. So over time, what developed was something we call diatonic music. And the Greek origin of that word is dia, which means through, and tonic, which means tone. So diakonos in Greek means at intervals of a tone. So the diatonic scale is what we as Western people know. 8 notes, there's actually 12 notes altogether because there are notes in between. But what is the foundation of Western music is that scale. That scale makes everything that we are familiar with happen. So if you imagine that each note in that scale has a number, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then we get back to 1, which is also known as 8, okay? So in that scale, there are 2 notes that are really unstable, and they're unstable because the tone value is less than a whole tone. So this is a whole tone. So the first note that is very unstable is the 7th. So if you're singing a song, you're never going to end on this tone, because this tone really, where does it want to go? It wants to go here. It just wants to go there. It just really wants to go there. The other note that's unstable is the 4th. This note wants to go here. It wants to go there, okay? So the other part of this music is that these notes can make chords. And a chord is made up of 2/3. And a third is from 1, 2, 3, right? That's a third. It's what I call the doorbell sound. That's how you know it's a third. And thirds can be major or minor. And we all know this without having studied it. And if you are not sure, here you go. Is this major or minor? Put your thumbs up for major. All right, set thumbs up, thumbs down. Now, if you're not sure, here, listen to this one. Right, so we know that. We know that without thinking about it. So the third of the chord is what has a lot of impact on how our music goes. The other thing is that in this time, they started adding more thirds. So this is 1/3, this is another third, right? They started adding more thirds. Here's another one, right? And that makes the chord really juicy and sexy. And this is one of the things that early on in the church was forbidden. So no 7ths. That was a 7th, all right? So the other thing that was not encouraged was parallel motion. So if you had a 4th or a 5th, this was not encouraged. Because there's all kinds of things that happened in there that sounded displeasing. At the beginning of the 20th century, Puccini and other composers start playing around with the rules. Debussy was huge at this. They start playing around with the rules, and they start trying things to make things sound different. And there is this sound which today is not a word we use, but in those days, oriental. There was an oriental sound to it. When you put fifths together, very different. So, and this also, these juicy chords and this parallel motion was also something that was showing up in jazz at the same time. So Puccini, when he's writing Il Tabarro and Suor Angelica and Gianni Schicchi, he's got this other sound in his head. So I'm going to try and play you the opening of Il Tabarro. because you'll see that this is, okay, the violins are playing. Okay, so there's no actual tonality, there's no thirds. You don't know where you are, you don't know what's leading to what. It's very open, and that makes it stable. And his idea about this was the action takes place in a barge that's anchored on a river. And so he has this, or in the harbor, this feeling of water flowing without a beginning and without an end. In the left hand, the basses are playing right? So let's see if I can do this. Like that. But you get the idea. It's got this undercurrent of again, without any thirds. You don't hear any thirds. Let's just take a moment and listen to a bit of the overture. This is the Dresden Philharmonic, conducted by Marek Janowski. Okay, so let's get back to Puccini. The other thing that I find interesting with these operas, and I said it before a little bit, is that much of the singing is not melodic, it's narrative. Sometimes there's a gorgeous melody in the orchestra, and the singer is singing something very bland on top of it. We'll hear the London Symphony Orchestra, Antonio Pappano conducting, and a whole slew of amazing singers as we go through these operas. Just listen for a moment. There is a gorgeous melody in the orchestra, and Giorgetta and Michele just sort of talk on top of it. For a moment in the distance, you hear Luigi, but it's not like a full-blown aria.
Dunque che cosa credi? Partiremo la settimana prossima. Vedremo. In talpa il t'incarrestano. Resterà anche Luigi. Ieri non lo pensavi. Ed oggi penso. Perché non voglio che gli crepi di fame. Quello sarà già sempre.
So you can hear that there's some beautiful melody happening in the orchestra, but they're not singing that melody. It's not the same. Like in Bohème, you go home and singing the big arias. So later, Giorgetta is lamenting to her lover, Luigi, that her life didn't turn out the way she expected. She says, "E ben altro mio sogno," which means my dream was much different. I'm going to play the melodic feature underneath that, and then I'll play it for you from the recording. So listen for this one. Just remember this. Let's listen to how it comes in the opera. She and Luigi do. Later in the aria, she and Luigi do go full blast, and they sing on the high notes together, but still it's not the same. So here it is. She's singing and it's beautiful, it's just not melodic. This is Giorgetta and Michele. They have a very lovely undermelody, and but they lead up to it again in fits and starts. And the words that lead into this is "Come è difficile essere felice." She said how hard it is to be happy, and they reminisce about how happy they were when their son was still alive. So here's the next thing. I'll play the melody, the whole melody, and then I'll play it from the piece. And there's also there's an accompanying figure, which is like the river. So I'm going to play the melody first and then the accompanying figure. So. What's underneath that is like that. So this is what that sounds like.
Come difficile essere perché non vai a letto? E tu? No, non ancora. Penso che hai fatto bene a trattenerlo. Chi mai? Luigi? Forse ho fatto male. Basteranno 2 uomini, non c'è molto lavoro.
And you see what I mean? That there's not really singing. They're sort of speaking. My impression is that Puccini's letting the music take the driver's seat. He's setting the scene. He's manipulating our emotions because this music is very poignant. And the singers are part of the staging. That again, it is the mood that he wants to convey. It's this thing that's a little more amorphous than an actual aria that stops for the audience to clap. Also, Puccini adds, and when you hear the opera, you'll hear this. It's very nice. He adds non-instrumental sounds. So at the very beginning in the overture to Il Tabarro, you hear the horn of a barge in the distance. It goes like that. There are car horns like the rant, rant, like those old klaxons, and even a hurdy-gurdy. You hear it as the stevedores and the women drunkenly dance. We recorded this during the first season of the HD transmissions that the Met did from the 2006-2007 season. And for some reason, it's not available on the Met's streaming site. I have access to the paid site, which I think is $15 a month, and it's not up. I don't know why. I have a friend who said he knows some sites where there are streaming, and it may be possible to get a DVD or maybe your local library. If somebody knows, this production was incredible from 2007. Maria Gulagina sang Giorgetta. Juan Pons was Michele. And Barbara Fritoli was Suor Angelica. And just, it was an incredible night. So now we get to Suor Angelica. Let's look at the characters in Suor Angelica for a moment. So Suor Angelica is a soprano. Her aunt, the princess, is a contralto, and the abbess is a mezzo-soprano. And then there's all kinds of other female singers. What's amazing about this opera is that it's all women. Sort of like the Carmelites. In the same way, Tabarro sound starts with the sound of the river. Suor Angelica, which was Puccini's favorite of these three operas, starts with the bells of the convent ringing from offstage. So you hear, this is what you hear as the opera begins. And it's so beautiful. I'm going to read to you from Maureen Woodall of the Pacific Opera Victoria in British Columbia, because she just writes very beautifully about these operas. And I'm quoting, "The essence of this story is of a young aristocratic woman who has been immured in the convent for 7 years after having a baby out of wedlock and bringing shame on her family. One day, her aunt shows up unexpectedly, and Angelica's heart is filled with wild, doomed hope. Puccini's eye for detail is striking as he lovingly sketches a bleak world colored with dreams of small pleasures, as the nuns confess their desires to see a lamb or to taste something delicious and celebrate when a fountain glows gold in the evening sunlight. The soundscape is gorgeous. Written for female voices alone, the opera juxtaposes ethereal choruses, delicate notes of church bells and bird song, along with the kind of intense, over-the-top emotion that only opera can convey. In this work, serenity and anguish are never far apart." She just says that so beautifully. Here, too, the music paints the action. Listen to this as two nuns return from begging alms with their little donkey, and they happily list all the things they got. So it seems to me that beginning is a direct reference to Carnival of the Animals by Saint-Saëns, a movement entitled Characters with Long Ears, which was written much, 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 much earlier. So Trittico is from 1918. Saint-Saëns' Carnival of the Animals from 1886. And although Saint-Saëns is almost a generation older than Puccini, Saint-Saëns was born in 1835. Puccini is born in 58. They were contemporaries. Saint-Saëns died in 1921, Puccini in 1924. And of course, Puccini would have known this piece. Take a listen. Actually, I'm going to play you what I played you again. This is the beginning of the nuns coming back with the little donkey. And this is Carnival of the Animals. Seems to me that's a direct reference. Suor Angelica's aunt shows up because Angelica's sister is getting married, and they want her to renounce her claim to her inheritance. Angelica says, "I can't give everything up to sacrifice for the Virgin." She can't forget the memory of her illegitimate son who was taken away from her 7 years earlier. The princess at first doesn't speak, and then she tells Angelica that her son died 2 years earlier, 2 years earlier from a fever. Suor Angelica is devastated. She signs the documents and she collapses in tears. And the princess leaves. And here's the music as she leaves. Angelica's heart is breaking. Sadness and you hear the heaviness. Suddenly, Suor Angelica is seized by a heavenly vision. She believes she hears her son calling for him to meet him in paradise. She makes a poison and drinks it. But then she realizes that in committing suicide, she has committed a mortal sin and has damned herself to eternal separation from her son. She sings La grazia di Cesa, that her fate is decided. And this is such beautiful music, and it's given to the orchestra only. Here, listen to this. And this is actually played by solo cello. So, we'll just listen to it right now. I'm going to tell you how this ends up because you need tissues when you watch it. But here. And it goes on like that. It's such beautiful music. Suor Angelica begs the Virgin Mary for mercy, and as she dies, she sees a miracle. The Virgin Mary appears along with Suor Angelica's son, who runs to embrace her. It's very, very sad. And we can't see it, and all of us are crying. Okay, last but not least, Gianni Schicchi. Let's look at who all the characters are. Actually, you only need to know 3 of them, but we'll look at it. So, we have Gianni Schicchi, we have Lauretta, we have Zita, we have Rinuncio. So really you need to know Gianni Schicchi, Lauretta, Rinuncio, his nephew who he's, Lauretta and Rinuncio are in love. And then there's all these other people who want a piece of the guy who died. So, this is a raucous romp of comeuppance. Listen to the beginning of the overture, and it's off the beat. So you'll hear da dum ba dum ba dum ba dum ba. It's ba dum ba dum ba dum ba dum. It's great. Okay, so it opens in the bedroom, and I'm going to read again from Maureen Woodall. This is the last opera that Puccini completed, and sadly, his only comedy. The place is medieval Florence, 1299 or so. The scene opens in the bedroom of Buoso Donati, who just died. His body lies cooling in his bed, and his relatives are devastated, for they just found his will, which leaves all of Buoso's money and his prize mule to a monastery. Things look hopeless until the family asks for help from a clever rogue named Gianni Schicchi, the father of the girlfriend of one of the would-be beneficiaries, who agrees to impersonate Donati to fabricate a new will and win a dowry for his daughter Lauretta. The piece of music in this opera that everyone on earth knows is the famous aria. Yes, there's a show-stopping aria. It's called O mio babbino caro. The Italian word for dad is babbo, and daddy is babbino. This aria is not a love song. Rather, it is a teenage tantrum. She says, "Daddy, if you don't let me marry the boy I love, I'll just die." Literally, for she threatens to throw herself off the bridge of the Arno if she can't have her way. Puccini uses this piece not so much as a showstopper, but more as an intermezzo. This aria divides the action of the piece and provides respite from all of the chaos that we've been seeing. Everyone's singing at once, constant movement. The words are, "Oh mio babbino caro, mi piace, è bello, bello, vuoi andare in Porta Rossa e comprare l'anello." And it goes, "Oh, sweet daddy, I like him. He's so handsome, so handsome. I want to go to Porta Rossa and buy a ring. And if I can't have him, if it's all been for nothing, I'm going to Ponte Vecchio and throw myself in the Arno. Please, 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 daddy." You get here's the entire aria, sung by the wonderful Angela Giorgio.
Oh mio babbino caro, mi piace bello, quando in Porta Rossa compirar l'anello. Sì, sì, ci voglio andare, e se la mossa
Isn't that gorgeous? Just gorgeous. I find it remarkable that the cleverness of the story and the wittiness of the music is enduring. I feel like as long as human nature doesn't change, and it doesn't really change, this opera will be hysterical and accessible forever. From the beginning, Schicchi was the most warmly received of the three, and still it turns up most frequently, often torn from its siblings, forced into a partnership with some other work in the service of providing a shorter evening for the audience. Usually something paired with something like Pagliacci or Hansel and Gretel, Bluebeard's Castle, and sometimes even with Strauss's Salome or Electra. One of the most memorable of these was the March 12th, 1949 Metropolitan Opera Saturday afternoon broadcast, when Schicchi, with the ritzy cast of Italo Taggio, Chloe Elmo, Lucia Albanese, and a young tenor named Giuseppe Di Stefano, preceded Salome with the incandescent soprano Ljubka Welich and the legendary conductor Fritz Reiner. It is interesting to note that at the premiere in New York in 1918, the Met's then general manager, Giulio Gatti Casazza, who had run La Scala from 1898 to 1908 and would be at the Met from 1908 to 1935, he raised the prices of the seats from $6 to $7, which is about $120 today, just for this performance because he knew that it would be a sold-out event. Puccini was paid $7,000, which is the equivalent of $120,000 today, in advance for the premiere performance on Earth, plus $400, almost $7,000 today, a performance for at least 5 additional performances. The newspapers of the day decided that the occasion was proof that New York is now musically on the universal map, as the saying goes, since Puccini, who once would have preferred Rome, Milan, Naples, or Venice for the scene of a new production, now gladly sends his work across the Atlantic for production at the Metropolitan of New York. The day after the premiere, Met General Manager Gatti Casazza sent a telegram to Puccini saying in part, quote, "Most happy to announce the complete, authentic success of the Trittico. At the end of each opera, long, very sincere demonstrations, more than 40 warm curtain calls altogether. Daily press confirms success, expressing itself very favorably on worth of the operas, enthusiastically for Schicchi. The truth was, the audience loved Schicchi, but didn't really get the other two, and most of the ovations were for Schicchi, which is why he said 40 in total. I said this earlier, but it bears repeating. The more I read, the more I saw that Puccini, aside from his personal life, was terribly hard on himself, and maybe even in his personal life, who knows. He went back and forth. He was hard on his collaborators, mostly with his librettists. With his librettist Illica, he spent 10 years, I told you this, 10 years considering and another 3 years working on an opera concerning the imprisonment, trial, and execution of Marie Antoinette, only to then abandon it. It made it impossible for the people he worked with because they never knew where they stood, but it also makes the observation that he was lazy or superficial, perhaps somewhat unfair. Also, apparently, if you look at his scores, there are tons of markings by other hands. He had people writing out the scores, but also the revisions. Verdi was sure of himself. He knew what he wanted, and somehow Puccini was not. There are a whole bunch of books now on Puccini, all of which come to the basic same conclusion. This was the life of an ordinary man who was gifted with extraordinary talent and fame. Oh, and before I finish, because my brother is in the audience and he always asks about chamber music, yes, Puccini wrote other kinds of music besides opera. There is a very famous quartet piece called Chrysanthemum, which is basically he lifted from Menalisco. So 2 symphonic pieces. I said it before. He Capriccio Sinfonico. There's 4 quartet pieces, a piece for solo piano, maybe more, 17 vocal pieces, and he wrote 10 operas in total. And if you consider again the output of some other composers, not like Verdi, but some other, where they wrote 30 operas and we only know one of them, or if that, it's pretty amazing that of these 10 operas, we play 7 of them regularly, and I've played Rondine a bit. So it's pretty, like 80% of his work was a hit. And a little bit of trivia. The operas are set in time backwards. So he writes Tabarro to take place in his own time in 1918. Suor Angelica is supposed to take place in the 1600s and Gianni Schicchi in the late 1200s. In 2008, Woody Allen was hired to direct Schicchi at the Los Angeles Opera. He set it in the neorealist style of the 1950s, sort of like a Fellini. But that was only after his initial ideas to make Schicchi either a rat among mice or a cigarette among organic produce were rejected. I'm not actually opposed to filmmakers directing opera. In these last months, I've been filming myself. I've been looking at film editing, and I've been watching a lot of films and seeing how narratives are conveyed on film. It's not easy, and it can be very subtle. It's definitely an art form, the visual techniques of storytelling. There's a notable list of film directors, starting with Zeffirelli, but it's too long to list here, who have had great success in both media, in film and in opera, and I'm a fan. And before I finish, I have a few more notes of a personal nature. After 33 years, I've decided to leave the Metropolitan Opera. Clearly, I have already started chapter 2. You'll notice I avoid the words retirement and pension, but that's what it is. I've started a website. Please stay tuned. My website is my name, Desiree Elsevier, all one word, .com. Please check it out. Please look at things. I've done all kinds of things, and some of them are just early ideas, but there's a seed of something that's going to happen. I have all kinds of plans, and we'll see what actually germinates. One thing is for sure, though, when the Met is up and running and they start doing HD transmissions, I will be hosting salons in preparation for those events in movie theaters. I'm hoping in Dallas to lead a field, have a field trip of a group of people. There's a synagogue near me where I hope to teach. But I will also be doing a Zoom salon. And in the email that I send you tomorrow, I'm going to send you the video link to this. But also, I've done two things recently, one in Dallas and one is going to be online, that are public, that you would like. So one of them is a masterclass, which will happen next Sunday afternoon on a platform called Lesson Face, and I'll give you the link. Me and two others of my colleagues at the Met are giving lessons in public, which is what a masterclass is, online. And this is through the Met Orchestra site, and they need all the support they can get. So even just showing up, don't have to pay anything, just show up. The more people who watch, the better. And I played a video concert here in Dallas a few weeks ago, and by a weird coincidence, it's streaming for the first time tonight, but it's available. It'll be available, and I'll put the link in the email tomorrow. I did a string trio. A string trio by Irving Fine, who was a contemporary of Leonard Bernstein, and Schumann Piano Quartet, Opus 47. Okay, that's all I got. Questions? Turn your sound on. Everybody turn your sound on and talk so I can hear you.